There's a wonderful scene in one of the recent Planet of the Apes motion pictures. I think it was the second one, when Caesar, the leader of the apes, has developed the ability to speak, as a few of them have moderately. And they do some of it through signs, some of it through grunting that becomes words. And the apes have sort of created a reservation, a little mini society in the woods of California. And you see a little school going on in like a treehouse. You see other people, other apes who are the builders. And you see a burgeoning, growing, baby, infant society. Caesar, the leader of the apes, is in a meeting, a discussion with some of the other ape leaders, and he says something so simple yet so significant, where we have to think about the future. When he says that, he's talking about a future that he knows will not include him. Eventually, right? We all know that. And it was such a wonderful coming to humanity moment.
Okay, so you agree that what's happening right now with Trump is akin to fascism?
Yes. At least Mussolini fascism.
And what exactly is Mussolini fascism? What other kind of fascism is there? Because I feel like the word is being thrown around a lot, and it's being used to describe people on either side of the aisle, which is ironic.
The fascio is a symbol of ancient Rome, and it is a symbol of progress in democratic civil society. I'm sure that's news to a lot of people. But if you were a Roman magistrate coming to town, if you were a governor, a mayor, or what have you, you were accompanied by people carrying the fascio. The fascio was a bundle of wooden rods bounded together. And what that meant was that was an official government seal, which meant specifically that you represent the Senate and people of Rome, i.e., the direct representatives of the people, which was a revolutionary concept. You weren't a magistrate that represented a king or a dictator. And so the fascio is a symbol of diplomacy. Or if he had an axe in it, it meant that he also has military imperium, essentially of law enforcement, you could kind of say. Whoever you're dealing with knew exactly who they're dealing with. This person has the diplomatic authority of the Senate and people of Rome. Essentially, the Senate and the House of Representatives is what that means. But you're talking about what is essentially a diplomatic symbol. 30 years after the unification of Italy, you're talking the 1890s now. Italy's the united country, and Sicily and the whole south of Italy has lost out on the Industrial Revolution, basically because of oppression. What forms is what's known as the fascist labor movement, a socialist movement, a socialist patriotic movement. And it's socialism, yes, it was socialism, but all the rights that they were fighting for are the rights that were already in place in the United States. They're the rights that today anyone in the modern industrialized first world recognizes as basic human rights. And this was a Catholic, patriotic, socialist movement that essentially just wanted modern rights. And they sort of made a pact with another devil, which was mafia. The mafia realized they had already infiltrated the upper echelons of big business, the upper echelons of government. And what the mafia realized is that if they could also get a foothold in the lower rung of society, that is this workers' movement of the masses, then they could be fed by all hands of society on the bottom and the top. And so the fascio socialist labor movement made certain individual pacts with mafia that was supposed to give it teeth, because the government has the army. What do we have? Right? We have allegedly freedom of speech. And so what happened was La Mafia eventually betrayed the workers and the workers' movement. And so that movement was squashed in the early mid-1890s from below, with mafia betraying it from the inside, and from the top, when the Italian state, instead of like the United States, let's say, instead of negotiations, instead of the state realizing, you know what, maybe 12-year-old children shouldn't work in the sulfur mine for 16 hours a day. Instead, they used the National Army to massacre its own people in Sicily. So after the fascio labor movement largely failed, after being put down violently by the Italian state, which itself had only been around 30 years old at that point, Italy had gone through major problems domestically and overseas. One poor decision after another. So you had two different banking scandals going on at the Banco di Roma and the Banca di Sicilia in Palermo, where in the Banca di Sicilia, mafia had infiltrated to such an extent that it was essentially manipulating members of the board, which were giving out loans to fake identities, proxies, really, for people that were the real investors, who were mafiosi and members of the bank's own board. So you would have someone assuming the identity of a child, of a deceased person, or an identity that was totally made up. Now, if the loan defaults, the bank is hung out to dry, because the person they gave the loan to sort of doesn't really exist. The identity they gave it to doesn't exist, and the person who actually is the beneficiary of the loan is a mafioso that is a ghost, or a member of the bank's own board. So you have in Sicilian society the upper echelon, whoever is high enough in society to end up on the bank's board, and not the lowest echelon for sure, but certainly more of a working man echelon, sort of escalating into a property owner as mafioso. Both ends of the spectrum are fleecing society. The Banco di Roma, you have senators and representatives who are literally having the central bank print extra money to put in their pockets. So you may literally have millions of dollars out there that have identical serial numbers with other banknotes already issued. On top of that, you have atrocious Italian foreign policy, to try to catch up with the powers of Europe in colonialization of Africa. Unlike, for instance, the American founding fathers, who knew to avoid foreign entanglements after the birth and after the first couple decades of what was a young nation. You instead had Italian politicians thinking they have to go at sonic speed to catch up with England, to catch up with France, for instance, to make inroads into mattering at that point in history. You haven't had a colony? And it was disastrous. Disastrous. The Battle of Adwa, the Ethiopians played both sides against each other. It was brilliant. They used Italian backing to acquire arms from, say, France or England, modern arms, and the Italians not knowing the terrain. The Ethiopians used it brilliantly and ended up massacring the Italians. So it was very embarrassing. It was obviously the wrong thing to do from the get-go, and plenty of Italians knew that. And you even had Italian people creating a barricade on railroad tracks, preventing trains from transporting Italian soldiers to Africa. So again, it's something that I think a lot of Americans on both sides of the political spectrum take for granted when considering the choices made by American politicians traditionally compared to their counterparts throughout history have often, generally, had at least a modicum enough of altruism to put democracy and transparency above personal gain. People traditionally didn't enter American politics to get money. That's why the Rockefellers, certainly the first several generations of Rockefeller, stayed out of politics. It was only their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and there really was no more money to be made, then entered politics. The Carnegies didn't enter politics. Gates, the richest people in America traditionally do not enter American politics because that's not where money is to be had. And that's something that, frankly, is totally taken for granted by people, even considering all the just and proper criticisms and considering all the corruption that may happen. Along comes not just Mussolini, but someone like Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was a playwright, an artist, a poet, a screenwriter. He helped make the legendary motion picture Cabiria. And his literature was sort of, maybe a return is the right word, in that he sort of took the scope of the super saturated and rich Italian heritage going back millennia and looked at it through the lens of someone who appreciated where he comes from, appreciated Latinità, appreciated Romanità, appreciated all the particular aspects of Italian culture that since the fall of Rome, so to speak, were certainly not appreciated as a collective whole, because at least half of Italy was always occupied by the Spanish and the French, the cadet branch of what was initially a Spanish crown. So I sort of consider D'Annunzio akin to Dante and even Machiavelli in terms of a pan-Italianism, a pan-Latinism, and an appreciation of the full scope of our culture. And D'Annunzio was a hero in World War I as a pilot, and he actually, at the end of the war, occupied the Italian town or city of Fiume with 2,000 Italian troops. It was going to be given over to Croatia as part of the settlements of World War I, and he occupied it. The people of that town had to wait until the end of the negotiations to learn if they were going to be Italian or Croatian. And he even created a charter, a constitution, so to speak, and declared it an independent state, the official language of which was music. Now that shows Italian sensibilities for the arts, even in politics. You have people having lost faith in their institutions, believing in the unification of the Italian people, and several decades in now, they feel betrayed. And you have D'Annunzio, who sort of whetted the appetites of people again to be proud of our extremely rich culture. And of course, that sets the stage for Benito Mussolini. He was really getting at a reappreciation and a rebirth of our heritage, our Latin, Roman, Italian heritage, which frankly in movies today, it's always the same thing. It's always the big bad empire against the slave or the gladiator. That's just like every movie taking place during the United States of America's time on Earth, only being about slavery, only being about corporate greed, for instance. Now, whatever color and creed you are as an American, you know there's a lot more than that in American culture, which you even enjoy, which you even consume, which you even champion. And I think that Mussolini, his error was in trying to establish a rebirth of those aspects of Rome that were antiquated, to say the least, like imperialism. I wish he had focused more on the ancient Roman Republic, which is what American democracy is almost a total copy of. Instead of Mussolini cultivating the idea that we have to somehow reconquer all of the former territory of the Roman Empire, he would have done much better, and it would have been much more moral to focus on doing Italia. You know, let's do Italy. Let's focus on Italy. Let's focus on the aspects of Rome that made it one of the most egalitarian societies of its time, on the things that made the Roman Republic a meritocracy compared to most other societies of its time. Instead, he had a chip on his shoulder and believed that might would make right if it's in the name of Italian pride. The swastika was not a negative symbol. Hitler made it a negative symbol. And it's just really tragic with Mussolini that he bastardized and perverted the notion of what really was a symbol of native Latin, native Roman, native Italian progress through democracy. The fascio meant the Senate and the people. But what ends up happening is he's going to have his way, whether you like it or not. And so they reverted to violence. They reverted to less than democratic means of swaying the populace to vote a certain way. And it was in 1925 that they passed the Acerbo law, the Chatbot Act, which stipulated that whatever political party receives 25% of the vote gets, I think, 75% of the seats in parliament. So you're talking about a multi-party system. Not many people, no one gets 50% of the vote. So 25% is doable. They, of course, resort to violent means, to corrupt means, to make sure they get 25%, which in most parliamentary societies may mean that you won the plurality, that you're sort of the party in charge of what essentially is a coalition. But these new fascists, led by Mussolini, perverted the system, manipulated the system in a way that it meant that they own the system. And it was really at that point that the charade that he was anything less than a dictator was over. Obviously, Italia is now a one-party system. He's really not the prime minister. The king is taking orders from him. And it really becomes now a cult of personality, which again started from a positive message of Italian pride. And frankly, the Italians at that point could have used a little more pride in themselves. But he could have used the virtues of ancient Rome that were wonderful. Instead of, we are going to take over the Mediterranean again. In a lot of ways, domestically, Mussolini was very successful. He brought back a renourishment, sort of the arts, of civilian activity in their communities. People were able to be fed en masse. It's just that it was his way or the highway. You really weren't self-governing anymore. And if you stepped out of line, you get castor oil shoved down your throat. If you're being ruled by someone who is not responsible to the people, who is not subject to the will of the people, it's not about people power. It's about his power. So when Mussolini says, "Make Italia great again," does he mean giving more civil rights to more people than any other civilization, as was Rome's signature? Does he mean giving more people more access to the legal system than any other civilization, as was Rome's signature? Or does he mean we're going back to Africa to do colonization right and to avenge our humiliating defeat 30, 40 years ago? I find it hard to believe that Mussolini wouldn't know this. But the circumstances under which ancient Rome took over northern Africa was the circumstance of a people, the Italians, defending their right to live when the African Empire of Carthage was hell-bent on conquering Italy, generation after generation. And Italia won. So finally, after about 100 years, Rome said, enough is enough. and set up a colony there of Romans to live with Carthaginians in what is now a Roman province. Several hundred years later, at the end of the movie Gladiator, when Commodus dies, you have the first of a succession of African emperors of Rome. Ethnically African, born in Africa, what would have been Carthage, and is now a Roman province, are now the head of state. How Rome ended up taking over what is today Germany and parts of France. An encounter with a people you've never even heard of before, let alone seen. Showing up at your doorstep from the north, from the Alps, hell-bent on destroying and taking over your civilization. Now talk about preemptive. For the Romans, for the Italians, it was as if aliens had just come down. Never seen you before, never heard of you before, and all of a sudden we all have to get really sober really quick to fight this huge mass of people, which is what the Germanic people were. A nomadic people, hell-bent on taking over the peninsula of Italia to destroy Italian civilization, Roman civilization, and to plant seeds for their new home. Rome eventually won. Or King Mithridates of Pontus, parts of what today is Syria, parts of what today is Turkey, hell-bent on going west and conquering Italia, conquering the Romans, conquering Western civilization, who breaks a peace treaty with the Romans, who say, you know what, on that side of the Euphrates, you do you. We got a great relationship with the Greeks, we got a great relationship with Turkey, we're allies, and you can do you in your home, we're going to do us in our home. And he breaks it and he's hell-bent, and it's, I think, his grandson, several generations later, who Julius Caesar finally defeats and sends back the dispatch. Came, saw, conquered. Italia on all sides, doing Italia, and facing existential threats to its survival, to its right to live, and Italia prevailing. Now, if that is what Mussolini had meant by make Italia great again, that would have been nice. Back then, it wasn't the Clinton doctrine, the Bill Clinton doctrine, which is democracies don't go to war with other democracies. That was a cornerstone of Bill Clinton's foreign policy, believing that a world of self-ruling people will realize it's in their own best interest to not be in conflict with other nations, to not go to war with other nations. All these things, American belief in democracy, aimed at prosperity at an individual level, in the human dignity of self-rule, enabling peace. There were plenty of people who understood the values of ancient Rome. The fathers of Italian unification did, 75 and 80 years before the ascent of Mussolini. And those were the values around which they did unify the country before it took a disastrous direction after unification. He wasn't focusing on any of ancient Rome's moral foundation or pragmatism for ruling. They were drunk on the Kool-Aid that Mussolini was offering in a cult of personality. which at a certain point does not have a relationship to pragmatism, to the actual nature of the history you suggest you want to emulate, does not necessarily have a relationship to the truths of the now. And it's certainly not beholden to the will of the people, which at some point realize that the horses are out of the barn. And you're not going to get all of them back in again if you're going to get any back in. That may have been when Mussolini meets Hitler. And when he met Hitler, he thought Hitler was crazy. But in fairly short order, Hitler has sway over Mussolini because Germany has a stronger army, and you have two strong men who, if they're not allies, it means they have to be adversaries. And Hitler's stronger. Mussolini ascended to power over a decade before Hitler. It's now a circumstance where you sort of have a monster, not of your own creation, but of your own inspiration, who is now taking the reins in that sphere of influence from you. And so Mussolini may have felt that he had little option philosophically and pragmatically in terms of survival, had little other option but to side with Hitler. He may have felt, or certainly that train had left the station and the Italians found that they were on it. For Americans, consider President Johnson, LBJ. This was someone who, after he finished Kennedy's term as the vice president, becoming president, won his own election by 61% of the vote. That is extremely rare in American politics. What our two-party system ensures, sort of, is that each party has to be a large tent. Each party, whether you're right or left, actually houses variations and degrees of right and left. Whereas in Europe, you have a different party for each degree. And so no one in Europe tends to get 51% of the vote. They almost always lead by a plurality. So you get 20% of the vote, so your party is the head honcho of what has to be a coalition if this government is going to survive. And so you get circumstances where someone that most people did not vote for becomes prime minister. In the US, the two-party system ensures that each party is a large tent that includes all right-wingers on one side, all left-wingers on another side. And what that allows is for usually the winner of the presidential election to actually have a majority, to actually have at least 51%. And the person who wins the presidency does get an actual majority. The majority has spoken. But another aspect of American political nature is that people don't tend to win by large majorities in terms of the popular vote. Winning by 55%, winning by 53% is considered a decisive victory. And that's really not a lot. That still means that whoever wins, America really is a fairly centrist country. So for President Johnson to be elected with 61% of the vote is a hell of a majority that is almost never ever seen in American politics. This is a guy that went on to display immense political courage, to go against his own upbringing, to go against his own culture as a Southern American, not to Southern bash, but is someone going to tell me that's not part of the Southern culture, the Southern history? To go against the grain, to work with civil rights leaders, to work with Martin Luther King, to craft with him civil rights legislation, to go against what would have been politically expedient for him, to push it through at the expense of alienating the entire South because it was the right thing to do. He is the president that, other than Lincoln, has done the most for African Americans and minorities to end Jim Crow, to continually expand rights for all Americans. He got Vietnam totally wrong. He knew that the people may hold him accountable to that to such an extent that he's not going to be reelected, or whether it was that, which I'm sure the bottom line was, or the fact that he realized he was wrong and it's no longer appropriate to be in this office. He determined that he was not going to run for re-election because it would not be appropriate. He was wrong about a foreign entanglement, and despite the fact that 61% of the people voted for him, despite the fact that he did more good for civil rights than any president other than Lincoln, the fact that he created a social safety net that meant grandma and grandpa don't have to starve, that they can get medical coverage because they pay taxes their whole lives. He was wrong about one foreign policy issue and resigned. Well, he decided not to run again because of that. Think about that. Now consider George W. Bush, who was wrong about everything, who was entirely wrong about the Iraq War from whatever angle you want to kick the ball. Iraq, nothing to do with 9/11. Iraq, not an imminent danger to the United States because it did not have weapons of mass destruction, because it could never challenge the United States preemptively because it is so much weaker than the United States. All information that was readily available, all information that Americans knew. And as much as LBJ may have been dishonest with America, may have lied in terms of our operations in Vietnam and escalating Vietnam, he actually thought that communism was an existential threat. I think it's very fair to say he believed it. The Bush administration knew that they were purposefully duping the American people into thinking that we were going after those responsible for 9/11 by going after Iraq. The Bush administration knew Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. The Bush administration should have known that Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction. Although again, if they are so absorbed in a goal, having already committed to that goal before accumulating actual pragmatic reasons for having that goal, maybe some of them were so blinded that they did think he had them. Either way, they should have known that he did not. And then on top of that, the execution of the war and the American occupation of Iraq is incompetent, is amateur hour, and has become an entanglement that we are still responsible to, are still involved in 20 years on. Wrong about everything. Thousands of Americans dead in what was an attempt to steal another country's oil. Imagine Bush resigning or deciding not to run again because he was wrong about the reason, the purpose, the goal, the execution of his batshit crazy leap to attack Iraq instead of consolidating the effort for justice in Afghanistan. Bush, someone who the American people did not vote for, let alone get 61% of the vote. Well, he really wasn't commander-in-chief as much as he was spokesman-in-chief for the groupthink around him in his administration, led by Dick Cheney, who actually set policy. That's another video. For the past 28 years, America has not chosen right-wing politics in the executive branch of office. 28 years. So, right-wing Americans constitute the minority of Americans. And yet, through gerrymandering, they were able to dominate control of the legislative branch of government, the Congress, by manipulating voting districts state by state, states that they control, so that they can manipulate the amount of representatives the minority Republican Americans get in Congress. In the last several years, Republican-led Congress has stripped sections of the Civil Rights Bill, stripped civil rights, suppressed every American's right to vote. The Civil Rights Bill doesn't say black folks shall have the right, minorities shall have the right. It says no one shall be discriminated against for this, which means it protects white Americans as much as it protects minorities. They suppress that. Minority of Americans. They're going to have a 6-3 edge on the Supreme Court for the rest of many of our lives. Minority of Americans. Refusing to allow Obama to do his job, to nominate a replacement for Scalia 8 months before the election, suggesting that it is inappropriate to do so in an election year. Yet 3 weeks before the election, they are now pushing in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's replacement. The minority of Americans have that power. And the current commander-in-chief, Trump, again, someone Americans did not choose, who, like Bush, acts as if he got 61% of the vote. Someone who the majority of Americans know is an internal and existential threat, an internal threat to democracy, who cannot stop himself from breaking the law, who obviously is susceptible to acting in the interests of foreign adversaries before those of America, before American democracy. As much as it makes all of right-wing America say, well, this guy's biased for this or that, the majority of Americans know that this is true. I represent the way the majority of America thinks. The majority of America that has not voted right-wing in the executive branch for 28 years, but is nonetheless had to be submissive towards the will of the minority of Americans. In our democracy, it does all come down to the will of the people. If you don't like the Electoral College, you believe in the will of the people, you believe in democracy, we all might have a problem with the Electoral College because it doesn't provide for direct democracy. If we don't like that, we have the ability to change it. It's called self-rule. You want to make an amendment to the Constitution. There's a process for that. Enough states have to ratify it, and it has to be signed into law by the president. We have the ability to do so. We don't have the will. Obviously, the right wing will never allow that, because that's the only way they've attained power for the past 28 years. What happened to self-rule? The group think of the American right wing, the minority, have nonetheless been able to hold sway over American politics, even though during that entire time they do not represent the will of the people. And Trump is the apex of that, to the point where he can't even fake knowing stuff during the debates. He can't even fake intelligence. He can't even fake the part. The majority of Americans know he is only practically coherent during those debates, let alone someone who actually knows policy, actually has an agenda other than self-preservation. But you have millions of Americans who, like the fascists of Mussolini, weren't really involved in the depths of understanding of the ancient Rome, the ancient Italia that he was evoking, let alone the ability to admit that what he's saying, what his policies aren't really what made the country great back then, let alone what's going to lead the current country to prosperity. And I know that just the speaking of these things is automatically polarizing, but I do sort of have a resignation, because it doesn't matter how loudly I speak or how loudly most people speak. It speaks for itself. Once you have enough people refusing to believe what's before their eyes, once you have people who allow behavior they wouldn't allow from their own children, once you have Americans suggesting that this is not a democracy, elected officials suggesting that this is not a democracy, once you have Americans who believe so strongly that the opposite party is simply not legitimate, that the truth in your mind can be contoured any direction into a pretzel. Once you have such a long-standing minority controlling the course of an entire country that is supposed to be one of self-rule, of democracy, the horses are out of the barn. Once you have an entire electorate on one side that is more likely to believe the opposition is a pedophile ring, once you have an entire side of the political spectrum that can rehash, reshape, recontour the realities that are unfolding before their eyes and ears daily at ever-increasing speed and severity for 4 years, to whatever whims, there being no comeuppance for the constant flouting of the law, of the myriad constitutional crises from the moment he took the oath of office to now. Despite what the majority of Americans, despite what members of Trump's own cabinet have witnessed, his own administration has witnessed. The horses are out of the barn. The horses have been out of the barn. The train has left the station a long time ago. And American democracy is on that train. You know, the extreme left wing also shows elements of Mussolini fascism, but in a much softer way, because the left wing is terrible at accumulating or maintaining onto power. So it's done in a soft way through culture. There's no scientific basis whatsoever to suggest that someone with an XY chromosome is anything other than a man, regardless of the fact that maybe we can respect someone's wishes to refer to them by whatever pronouns they prefer, to respect someone's own sense of self-identity. But no, if you don't fall in line, you're canceled. You can't call someone Oriental despite the fact that it simply means Easterner, just like calling me Occidental simply means Westerner. If you don't fall in line, cancel culture. Now, just like the fascists, you don't fall in line, you're going to get castor oil thrown down your throat. Instead of there being an arena, an atmosphere of discussion. But we first have to agree that reality may be knowable, that what is before us may be knowable, may be examinable. But if the right wing is constantly changing the notions of reality, constantly challenging the notion of truth and what is knowable to fit the contours of a preordained and predetermined belief, which is that the other side simply is not legitimate, therefore whatever happens on the other side is not justifiable, and therefore whatever happens on this side is. That is Mussolini fascism. On the left side, if I'm so immersed in a crusade for of identity politics that whatever you say is a shock to my sensibilities, it's our way or the highway, there's not going to be an atmosphere in which you can have reason. There's a wonderful scene in one of the recent Planet of the Apes when Caesar, the leader of the apes, has developed the ability to speak. He says something so simple yet so significant, where we have to think about the future. When he says that, he's talking about a future that he knows will not include him. Eventually, right? We all know that. And it was such a wonderful coming to humanity moment. And I thought that was very telling about society and civilization in general. That the founding fathers, whatever their faults were, although were not shared by all of them, the faults, they believed in us. They believed in a future that obviously included us, not them. Now, I would suggest that Trump definitely doesn't think about the future of the country, as anyone that has occupied his office has. He, make promises of how we're going to repeal Obamacare. We're going to give you something that's better, awesome, literally using those words, and in 4 years has not come up with a single leaf of paper that has ideas on it that would be a counter deal or a suggestion for healthcare to Obamacare. And that is part of his party's platform and ideology for a great many things that when I was growing up, I thought had already been codified into society as liberal values that won out civil rights, women's rights, the notion that maybe we want to have a civilization that's good for health coverage and join the rest of the developed world. Sexual freedom and reproductive freedom, all the things for which the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the Clintonian third way of establishing consensus in a reasonable democracy. Rome wasn't founded as a democracy. It was a kingdom before it became a republic. They kicked out the kings because they wanted self-rule. And like the first 200 plus years of American democracy, were pumped and stoked and passionate about their right to live as self-governing people, of being a republic, repubblica in the Latin, which means a public affair, politics, not the affair of a king, not the affair of a dictator, but right-wing America, Americans, people. I'm not going to judge the heart and soul and mind of people, but certainly through their voting actions and their actions as a political body, don't even realize that they have acquiesced the rule of law, the will of the people, for the rule of one man and the will of one man. They're more likely to chant, "Lock the opposition up." Democracy is about you and me and our shared desire to work it out. That faith in something that is greater than ourselves, which is our right and ability to determine our lives and our futures together. Inherent in that is a belief in our mutual legitimacy and the process through which we determine our mutual path together. Once that process is bastardized, once that process is corrupted through our free will, or the free will of those among us who cling to power, then that's the beginning of the end for democracy. It's about us.